Scripture reading tonight will be from Psalm 35, verses 1 through 9. That's Psalm 35, verses 1 through 9. Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take up shield and buckler. Arise and come to my aid. Brandish spear and javelin against those who pursue me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. May those who seek my life be disgraced and put to shame. May those who plot my ruin be turned back in dismay. May they be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. May their path be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. Since they hid their net for me without cause, and without cause dug a pit for me, may ruin overtake them by surprise. May the net they hid entangle them. May they fall into the pit to their ruin. Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord and delight in his salvation.
I want to remind everybody about the meeting that's happening at Gold Hill Road this week. If you're not aware of the lead camp or the leadership camp for some of our young men, some of our young men are there this week. That has started tonight, I believe, and will go throughout the rest of the week. So pray for those young men who are a part of that. And also they have the gospel meeting. It starts tonight, and Alan Hires is the speaker, and I believe that's Sunday through Wednesday. So if you can make it any of the nights, I would encourage you to do so, especially Monday or Tuesday, so you can be back here on Wednesday for our 12 questions topic. And our 12 questions topic this week is one that's good. Eric Lyons is the speaker. He's from Apologetics Press. If you've never heard someone from Apologetics Press speak before, don't miss this opportunity. All of the guys who speak from Apologetics Press always do a fantastic job, and they do a great job on topics that most guys don't really study a whole lot and don't take the time to study a whole lot. They talk about apologetics, the case for God inside the Bible and outside of the Bible. And this week's topic is, God, where did you come from? Or where did God come from? Or God, do you really even exist? And as we said this past Wednesday, we've got to get that question first right in our minds and our faith right about that first before any of the other questions really take place and really matter. So please be here tonight. If you have a friend or a colleague at work or a family member who's ever doubted the existence of God, this would be a great one to personally invite them to. And if they don't live in town, and encourage them to watch it online either Wednesday night or shortly thereafter, as it will be available as all the lessons are on 12questions.org. And if you're not aware of that, all of the lessons from previous Wednesdays are available on that website and also available on our church website. So encourage folks to go back and to check all of those out, and let's continue to use this campaign to bring glory to God. Tonight I wanted to kind of continue a thought that we started last Sunday morning, as we talked about last Sunday, the difficulties, especially that our nation has gone through. And we won't dive in specifically to some of those, but we started out last week with asking the question, or talking about the fact that, when we talk to one another and usually we say, hey, how you doing? What's our general answer? Oh, I'm doing fine. Hey, I'm doing good. And we don't dive into the details of how things are really going most of the time. But if we asked America last week, how are you doing? Then our nation, if we were honest with each other, would say it's been a rough week. A lot of bad things happened last week and the last few weeks, really. And I said last week that there was a chance that things could get worse. There's a chance that things could get better, but there was a chance that things could get worse. And if you follow the news at all this week, you've known that things haven't really changed a whole lot. Things have continued to go down that way, not only in our country, but in other countries. There was a terrorist attack in Paris. There was a military coup in Turkey that failed. So whether that was a good thing or not, there was conflict, there was killing, there was this conflict within our world. And even today, if you haven't heard already, there was another police shooting this morning in Baton Rouge. So even in our own nation, things continue to go down a way that we don't want them to go. And we talked last week, and we won't take the time to get into it this week, but we talked last week about there being corruption and how you have to hate evil no matter where it's at. But you also have to hate the evil of killing innocent people. And we talked about both sides of that. And we talked about our responses as Christians. But in my experience, the overwhelming response to these types of tragedies, and especially tragedies that have happened one after another, after another, after another, when we think about our friends in the world, and one way to gauge that, not the only way, but one way to gauge that is through social media. The general response on social media is either anger towards one group or another group, or one group of people or another group of people, or being overwhelmed. how can we handle this? How can we make it through this other difficulty? And they just keep coming. And what I encouraged us last week to do was to make sure that we're being the positive influence on whatever situation may be happening, that we're doing something positive. We're not just complaining about what's happening in our world. And tonight what I want to encourage us to do is to make sure that we're not overwhelmed, but instead we're joyous. And I want us to look at some examples in Scripture of some believers, some followers of God who had extreme difficulty in their life, but continue to find joy in what most would consider very unjoyful circumstances. When you think about David, and you can complete this in your mind, David and, you probably said Goliath. Okay, that's what we generally think of, most of us at least, is David and Goliath, because we think of him as perhaps the giant slayer. Perhaps you thought David and Bathsheba, and that would certainly work as well. And other words or people's names that you could have thrown in there. You could have thought about David and Saul and their conflict. You could have thought about David and Ishbosheth. You could have thought about David and the Philistines and how he seemed to constantly have issues with the Philistines or the Amorites, or even his own son Absalom or Sheba, and many, many more. As you study the life of David's life, sometimes I think we like to make it really better than it is. We like to glamorize it. King David, the mighty king of Israel, and he was the best king that they ever had, but his life was not a peaceful life. His life was a life of conflict. His life was a life of war, a life of shedding blood, so much so that David, who God himself describes as a man after his own heart, who has the desire to build a temple for God, God tells him, you can't do that. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 3, God says to David, you shall not build a house for my name. Why? Because you are a man of war and have shed blood. And it's not just that David went to battle just against Goliath, or just a few times after that. David's life was a life of conflict, a life of war, a life of shedding blood. And Psalm 35 that was read to us, the first 9 verses of Psalm 35, is a psalm of David. And it reflects the reality of his life. In Psalm 35, we see that David is praying to God. He's requesting of God. He's writing this beautiful poem, if you will, to God. And he says, God, take up my cause. Fight for me, God, because you know I'm trying to fight for you. I'm trying to fight for your cause. He says, defend your servant, and I am your servant. He says, defeat my enemies, because I have many, as we've just read a long list of those. And he says, repay those who have dealt treacherously with me. David is in Psalm 35 asking God to fight for him, asking God to really take on his enemies, for God to take on his enemies himself, because perhaps David realizes he just can't do it alone. But in Psalm 35 and verse 9, despite all of this, despite the fact that David's life is a life of conflict, despite the fact that in Psalm 39 he's mentioning people are dealing treacherously with me. I have enemies. I have people on every side of me that are trying to fight against me. He says in Psalm 35 and verse 9 that my soul shall rejoice in the Lord. It shall exult in His salvation. In the midst of conflict, in the midst of difficulty, David says, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in His salvation. And again, there's one of those words that we don't use very often, exult. When's the last time you said to someone, I exult about this? We don't say that word, right? But what does that mean? It's extreme joy. It's extreme happiness. It's declaring our happiness to other people. It's a visual symbol or a symbolization of just how pleased we are about something. He says, I will exult. I'm excited. I'm happy. I'm pleased in God's salvation. So in the midst of difficulty, David finds joy still in God's salvation and in God's love and even in God Himself. Nehemiah is another man who faces a great deal of conflict. Nehemiah is one who is taken away into captivity. So his countrymen, his people have been defeated, and he's taken away to a foreign land. He's taken away from everyone he's ever known, to taken away from the land that he knew, and he's taken away to be a slave, to be a servant. Now he's a trusted one. He's a cupbearer to the king, but he still can't make a decision for himself. He still has to be told what he can do or given permission to do anything that he might want to. And we've studied about Nehemiah before. You're probably familiar with the story of Nehemiah. But there are a group of people who come back from Jerusalem, who come back from Israel, and Nehemiah asks them, How are things going back home? Remember, he's been taken away from everything that he knew and loved, and he's concerned about how are things going. And what's the report? Things are bad. The wall's torn down, and the people are torn down with it, is basically the report that's given to him. And he yearns to do something about it. So he is able to eventually, with the help of God and with the help of the king that he's working for, he gets back home and he begins to help rebuild. And he starts with the wall. Remember, he's not really so concerned with the wall, though it's important. He's really more concerned about rebuilding the people. And again, we probably don't appreciate the idea of a wall in ancient times. But it's really the whole idea of security. If you didn't have a wall around your city, you weren't secure. Sometimes you weren't secure from perhaps storms, and you certainly weren't secure from enemies or from anyone who might come in and harm you. So this wall was extremely important. But it was going to be a difficult task. And here's a few reasons why it was going to be a difficult task. The first reason, and maybe the biggest reason, and this is probably a big issue for a lot of people who are in leadership. The people who lived in Jerusalem, the people who lived there, they walked by a broken down wall every day. And they knew exactly how important that wall was, and they didn't do anything about it. The people were lazy. The people were apathetic. The people were disinterested. So the first hurdle that Nehemiah had to overcome was to get the people to realize, hey, you realize this wall thing, it's a big deal. We need this wall to protect us. If we're going to rebuild our town, if we're going to rebuild our people, it starts with rebuilding this wall so we can have the feeling of security. So the first thing he had to do was to overcome his own people's laziness. He also didn't have any resources. He's a slave. He doesn't have anything that he needs to make this wall a reality. But through his faith and obedience to God, and because of the relationship that he had with the king that he was the servant to, he's able to get those resources. He's ridiculed. As he and the people are rebuilding this wall, some of the enemies around him in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 3, they ridicule him. And they even say, they're kind of joking back and forth to each other. And they even say, if a fox jumped on that wall, it'd fall over. So they're being ridiculed in the midst of trying to do something that is vital for their people. And the enemies are ridiculing them. And also a trap is laid. Nehemiah is invited to come and meet with his enemies. What do you think his enemies' plan was when they invited him? Was it to make sure that things were going well and to help him along his way? Of course not. It was probably to capture him at best or to kill him at worst. They didn't want him to succeed. And there was a threat. Even when the wall was almost completed, there was a threat of a coming attack. So Nehemiah is, just like David, in the midst of being persecuted, in the midst of going through difficult times, in the midst of threatening times. And finally, when the wall is rebuilt, and the people should be rejoicing, turn to Nehemiah chapter 8. Nehemiah chapter 8. The wall is rebuilt in just 52 days, and the people are excited. But in Nehemiah chapter 8, Ezra, who's the priest there, he comes and they find the law of God, and they read the law of God. And notice in this midst of should be an exciting time, notice the response of the people. In Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, it says, Then Nehemiah, who was governor, and Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the peoples, This day is holy to the Lord. Do not mourn or weep. Why do they say that? It says, For all the people were weeping when they heard the words of the law. So here's the picture. They're successful. Things are actually, in this instance, they've overcome their enemies. And they're successful in this instance, but then they recognize that spiritually, they're still not where they need to be. The law is read to them, and they're weeping and they're mourning. They're distraught over the fact, not that they've just should be excited about rebuilding this wall, but they realize, no, we're still not right. We're still in a horrible position because we're not right with God, and they weep and they mourn. Notice verse 11. Notice the response that these folks have to them. Verse 10. Then he said to them, Go, eat of the fat and drink of the sweet, and send portions to him who has nothing prepared. For this day is holy to our Lord. Do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. The joy of the Lord is your strength. David said, again in Psalm 35 and verse 9, My soul shall rejoice in the Lord. It will exult in his salvation. I'll find joy in God. In this verse in Nehemiah, he says, yes, we've rebuilt this wall. We should be excited about this. God is pleased that we've done this. And yes, you recognize and you realize that you're still not where you need to be, that there's still some conflict, there's still some difficulty, there's still room to grow, but find joy in the strength of the Lord, or your joy is the strength of the Lord, or your strength is the joy of the Lord. Excuse me, I'll get it right. And your strength is the joy of the Lord. So what's he trying to say here? What's David trying to say? What's Nehemiah trying to say? Well, David is saying, in the midst of all this difficulty, in the midst of all this pain and conflict in my life, I'm going to find joy in God. And Nehemiah, even though the people in some ways are successful, they recognize that they're still not quite right. And he says, but your strength can still be the joy of the Lord. In the midst of our difficulties in life, we can still find strength in the joy of the Lord. Well, what is the joy of the Lord? Well, what is this thing that we should find strength in? Turn to Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, we've read this passage before, and you're familiar with the fact that Hebrews chapter 11 is the hall of fame of faith, or the hall of faith. We read about all these Old Testament characters that through faith did this and through faith did that and gained approval because of their faith. But let's take the time to read it again. And it mentions some pretty big characters from some pretty big individuals that will recognize these names. It talks about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. And we recognize most of those names, and we know what those people did, and because of their faith and their faithful obedience to God, they gained approval to God. But notice it also mentions some other folks in verse 32 through 40. In Hebrews 11, starting verse 32, the Hebrew writer says, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, of Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, and of Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourging, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted, and they were put to death with a sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom this world is not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. Our brethren who are a part of God's kingdom have faced difficult times before, and have faced difficult times because of their faith before. I was thinking today, we've got these different things that are going on in our world. We've got race relations that are suffering severely right now in America, but that's happened before, hasn't it? There was a time when race relations were even worse than they are now, perhaps. America is at war in different parts of the world, where we may call it, peacekeeping, but our soldiers are dying, so it's a war. But hasn't that always happened, not just in America, but in the world? There's always wars or rumors of wars, aren't there? There may be cold wars or there may be hot wars, but there's always been and there always will be conflict. And that's why you and I have to realize that we don't want things to get worse in our world. And we certainly don't want things to get worse in our nation. But it might. And if you and I as Christians place our hope in, well, hopefully things will get better. And we don't place our hope in God, then we're placing our hope and our joy in the completely wrong place. If I don't look at, well, my hope is heaven, my strength is the joy of the Lord, the salvation that I get because of that promise that He has made to me, then we've got our priorities all mixed up. Notice what it says about these faithful men and women in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 through 16. Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. After mentioning a few of these individually named characters, he says, and these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. What were they thinking? Were they thinking, man, I hope things get better on this earth? No, they were thinking, man, I can't wait till things get better in heaven with God. Verse 14, For those who say such things, you and I can say such things, make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of a country from which they came out, they would have had opportunity to return. The Hebrew writer says, if they were just talking about going back home, each of them had the opportunity to go back home. But they weren't talking about home. They were talking about somewhere better than anywhere on earth. Verse 16, but as it is, and this is a powerful verse, as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, this is powerful, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. God is not ashamed to be called their God. Have your actions, has your lack of faith caused God to be ashamed that you call Him your God? Because of the faith of these men and women, not just a belief, but a faith that led to action, a faith that led to doing what they could do and to finding joy in this future hope of a heavenly home, God was proud to be called their God. God was not ashamed in any way at all. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, we kind of see the fruition of this as we think about finding joy in the strength, or our strength being in the joy of the Lord. Hebrews chapter 12. Notice verses 1 through 4. Therefore, we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. Looking back to chapter 11, all of these people have been faithful. And you and I can think about faithful brethren that we have had in our lives. Since we have so many people that have been faithful, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Pay attention to this. The author and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before Him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Notice the connection between the joy that He experienced and the cross that He was facing. He said, for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross. Is that talking about Jesus was joyous about going to the cross? No. Jesus wasn't excited about going to the cross. Jesus prays to God the Father, if there's any other way that we can do this, let's do it that way. I don't want to die this cruel and painful death on a cross. Can't we surely do it some other way? He was looking forward to what the cross would accomplish. The joy of Him being able to go back to heaven and being with God again, and also all of us having that opportunity because of His sacrifice. For the joy set before Him, what did He do? He endured the cross. So you and I, that applies to us. When you and I are facing difficult times, when our world is in chaos, when our world is in turmoil, we can still find joy. Maybe not joy in this life, though there are many things to be joyous about being a Christian even in this life. There are many things that we enjoy, but just about living this life. But there is a greater joy, a true joy, that is waiting on the other side of eternity for us, the other side of our lives. Notice verses 3 and 4. For consider Him who has endured such hostility by sinners against Himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. It seems like in verse 3 that there were some Hebrews, there were some Christians here that had began to be discouraged and perhaps be overwhelmed. And he says, consider Jesus. Think about Jesus, who endured such hostility so that you won't grow weary and lose heart. It's easy in the midst of chaos. It's easy in the midst of being surrounded by evil actions and things happening in our nation that maybe we never thought would happen. There being corruption in law enforcement, or there being folks who would seek out to murder people for that type of reason. Did you ever even think something like that would happen? Now, some of you have probably experienced similar things, even in our own nation before in your lifetime. But for those of us who are younger, maybe we never even crossed our mind that something like that would happen. And not just things like that, but there's conflict and there's difficulties and there's chaos all over this world. And we just don't always think about it because it doesn't happen in our country or our community. But there's difficulty around this world. And we can still find joy, not necessarily because of the good things that are happening around us, but because of the good things that are waiting for us. And that's why Paul says in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. I want us to think about two songs as we wrap up tonight. There's a song that we sing. It's, I guess, more you might consider a devotional song, or a song you sing at camp, a camp song, even though it should be a song that we could sing too. It's called Someday. And it's a beautiful song. It's one of those 4-part songs where the altos lead, and then comes in another part, and then comes in another part, and eventually all 4 parts are singing, and they're singing different words. But here are basically the words. The first verse is pretty simple. It's just someday, repeated 4 times. Someday, 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 someday. But that's a longing for. It's not just saying any particular day. It's a longing for the day that you and I will get to be in heaven. The second verse says peace and joy and happiness and no more sorrow. The joy of there being peace, there being that joy and happiness and no more sorrow. Do you long for that day, whenever that day may come, when that will be the reality? The next verse says, I've got to be ready when He calls my name. One day, God's going to look down on you as a faithful Christian, and He's going to say, enter into the joy prepared for you. Do you long for that day? And the last verse says, the trumpet will sound, and the dead will rise to walk the streets of gold someday. Do you long for that day? And the picture here is that someday things are going to get better. Again, those faithful brothers and sisters in Hebrews chapter 11, you think about Nehemiah, you think about David and all the conflict that God's people have really always gone through because they're humans and they live on an earth that is full of conflict, and because they're Christians and some people didn't like them because of their faith. All of them longed for something better, and you and I must long for something better. We must place our hope and our faith and our joy in what is to come and not in what is the here and now. Because if we place our joy in the here and now, it might get better, but it might get worse. But one day, someday, it will get better. If you have your songbooks, you can turn to the invitation songs. It's number 646. 646, it is well with my soul. And this verse, this song presents a similar idea to the song Someday. And this will be the invitation song, and Ryan will lead it here in a second. But I just want to read through it and think about the contrast. It talks about good things happening, and it talks about bad things happening, and it talks about our response as Christians whenever these things happen. Verse 1 says, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Verse 2, my sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin not in part but the whole is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, O my soul. In verse 3, and this should be our attitude and our mindset and the importance of us sharing the gospel with others. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. As I said last week, and as I said to start with this evening, none of us know if things are going to get better. We think they are, because we live in a nation where things, for the most part, for Christians have been pretty good. Even for people who aren't Christians, we live in a pretty peaceful nation. Even though our soldiers are away at war and our soldiers die every day for other people's freedom, most of us on a day in and day out basis, we don't think about that because it doesn't affect us individually. But we don't know if things are going to get better. Things might get worse. But if things get better or if things get worse, our hope and our joy must be in heaven and not on this earth. Because the hope of this earth and the joy that exists on this earth will not last. Only that focus of what's in heaven and what awaits us on the other side of death can give us true joy. So we need to make sure that we're doing all that we can to make this world the best place that it can, because we're supposed to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Make this world a better place, Christian. That's our job, by spreading the gospel to each and every person, one individual at a time. But don't place your hope in this world. Place your hope in the world to come. If you need anything tonight, please come as we stand and sing.